see him. And this is the scene I wanted you to picture. He lived on East 48th Street near Lexington, near UN Plaza. It was a rainy day. I came to New York. I knew this wife, Jill Kremens, was a very ambitious, beautiful woman, quite a force of nature, apparently. So I stopped the cab, I got out, went into a flower shop, bought a big bouquet of flowers, got back in the cab, and drove over to East 48th Street, okay? Now I've got my flowers, and I've got my notebook and my digital tape recorder. And picture this scene. The cab pulls up, it's drizzling. I get out of the cab, the door opens, and it was a brownstone, so the door was really sort of on the second floor with a steep flight of steps. The door opens, and out stepped Kurt Vonnegut, hair blown, white tennis shoes, chinos, and a white sweatshirt, and I'm stepping out of the cab with flowers. And for all the world, it looked like I was picking up my date for prom. And he was very glad to see me. So we go inside, and the second clue, I think, that he really was looking for sort of male friendship was that he did something, it's a time-honored custom among boys when they're very small. I come to the house, I no sooner hand off the flowers to the maid who's standing there, then he turns to me and he says, "Want to see my room?" Sure, let's go see your room. So we go up the stairs, go to the third floor, and here's his room. And it's got a queen-size bed for queen-size naps, I guess, and a desk overlooking 48th Street, hanging shelves all along one wall. And I noticed that he had a lot of his pen and ink sketches leaning up against the wall. They were matted, you know, and they were leaning up against the wall in a stack. And I went over and I said, "Mind if I look at these?" He just beamed. I was showing an interest in things that he liked. And I flipped through them and made all the appreciative noises that I could and asked him about his art influences, Paul Klee, you know, and things like that. And we had a good time. And then it was back downstairs and off to a restaurant down the street that he particularly liked. And he just opened up. It's interesting. I think I caught Kurt at a time in his life when, more than being validated by a biography written about him, he wanted to tell his story, no holds barred. He was an elderly man, he had grandchildren, and now, by God, he was going to let it all hang out. Because we no sooner get to the restaurant, and there's nobody else in there except us. It's about noon, and it's a cold, rainy day. Then he just starts to talk about all of his grievances with his parents. How his father never taught him to do anything. His mother was like a guest in his life. How much he resented his older brother Bernard, that hilarious baboon, as he called him. And I said, "Mind if I take notes?" And he said, "No, not at all." So I started writing down this laundry list of crimes against him in childhood by people who should have taught him, who should have loved him better, who should have been for him. Now we're talking about events that happened 70 years before, 80 years before. And to him, the wounds are as fresh and as painful as if they had just happened the week before last. So after our lunch, I went home and I typed up all these notes. And I was very open with him about all this kind of thing. I would send him things that I had learned and send him long letters that quoted people he had asked me to talk to. We had a lively correspondence going back and forth. And here's some of the things that I found out about Kurt. First of all, he was a strong believer in life as just a series of accidents. You hear Kurt tell it, life has about as much determination to it or pattern to it as falling down a flight of stairs. Because from the very get-go, he started talking about the accidental things that had happened to him. And you know, when you first start to interview someone, what they tell you in the first 10 or 15 minutes is really critical. I think psychologists call it presentation. Kurt wanted me to know about all of the flim-flams and accidents and things that had brought him to this point. For example, his parents lost all of their money during the Great Depression. Consequently, they fell precipitously out of the upper middle class to the lower class, lost all of their servants, and that's when his mother began to crack up and take barbiturates. That's when she was on medication because she felt that she had suffered a terrible loss in her life. Next major accident. He wants to go to college in English, but his older brother Bernard, who turned out to be a brilliant atmospheric scientist, insists to their parents, no, Kurt can't go into the arts. It's not real. It's nothing you can hang a career on. He should be invested in the career of the future, which is technology and science. So he goes to Cornell in technology and science, which he had no interest in studying. Because of that, he got bad grades. Because of that, he dropped out. Because of that, he joined the army rather than be drafted. Because of that, he ended up at the Battle of the Bulge. And because of that, he was captured by Germans. His entire regiment was cut off. Because of that, he was sent to a concentrator or POW camp. And then, perhaps the greatest accident of all, about 2 weeks staying at the Stalag, the POW camp, all the GIs were told to line up. A German officer came along, looked them up and down, and said, you. And they stepped out, not knowing what they were being asked to do. Turns out that a work detail was being formed. They needed 150 men to work in a malt factory in Dresden. And he took all these likely-looking specimens and said, you are now Arbeitskommando 157, you're the work detail 157. The following day they got on a boxcar and they were taken into Dresden. And he thought he had lucked out. When they stepped off the boxcar in Dresden, here was an untouched 800-year-old city. All Baroque and Rococo, absolutely beautiful. It had been one of Napoleon's capitals during the Napoleonic period. It had been where Mozart performed in a local church. It was absolutely beautiful, and yet it had somehow weathered the war unscathed. In fact, people were so unconcerned with the war that when he and his 150 fellow POWs walked down the Strasse toward the slaughterhouse where they were going to be housed, no one gave them a second glance. They were accustomed to seeing this kind of thing. The trams were running. People were having breakfast in outside cafes the morning that he showed up. And he thought, is this an easy duty or what? I could have been standing around in the piney woods caging smokes off the Brits, and now I'm in Dresden. So they put them up in the barracks inside a slaughterhouse, and slowly he began to realize that it was not the cushy, perfect little niche to be in the war after all. First of all, they were running out of food. And the Germans were adhering to the minimal requirements of the Geneva Convention to keep body and soul together. They found that they were told to do heavy work and heavy lifting, a lot of pushing and things, and yet all they got every day in the morning was a cup of coffee and a thick piece of black bread, and in the evening they got thin soup, and every other day they got a wedge of cheese. And that's what they had to exist on. Kurt, who was 6'3", got down to 140 pounds, got psoriasis, his teeth began to wiggle because he was, had problems with scurvy, skin problems. And then on the night of February 13th, they were rousted out of bed by a guard and a couple of other men who hustled them across the yard and down into a basement 60 feet below where there were sides of beef hanging on hooks that were curing. They closed the doors. There was one light bulb swinging back and forth, and above them, as Kurt said, he heard giants walking. The RAF was pasting that city for hours. And then there was a silence. They wondered whether they should come up. But it started again, and this time it was the 8th Air Force pounding that city. The ceiling shook. Calcium dust floated down. That bulb just began to go waggle back and forth. Finally, there was silence 8 hours later, and they came up, and Dresden was gone. The city of Venice on the Elbe was its nickname, on the Elbe River, had been destroyed. 60,000 people were dead. All the nurses they saw pushing prams at the hospital nearby, the stadium where they could hear cheers for the soccer matches, the church towers poking up everywhere, all devastated, and the smell of burning brick and creosote and plaster filling the air. Well, Kurt realized that he had a great story to tell, that this was a moment in history that he could turn to writing somehow. It was the end of civilization, and yet, unlike the Iliad, he was missing the middle. He had come when it was a city. He had gone underground, come up, and there was no city. He was not there for the bombing. He was not there for the valiant efforts at saving life. He saw no acts of heroism or anything. He saw a city, and then he saw burning rubble. For the next 4 or 5 weeks, the men on the detail were forced to become what were called body miners. They went down into the basements and retrieved the bodies of people who had taken shelter down there. The firestorm was so fierce that it sucked all the air out of every available space. And he said when you went down there in the darkness in the flooded basements, there were grandmas and children and parents and couples sitting on benches and just slumped over, he said, as if it were a busload of people who had suddenly had simultaneous heart attacks. For weeks they went down there. The smell became awful, as you can imagine. Finally, they gave up retrieving the bodies at all, and they just went down and take pieces of identification to bring them back up. And then specialists from the Holocaust camps came and using flamethrowers shot directly down into the basements and turned those basements they were no longer refuge places now, but they had turned into charnel houses. And then they bulldozed in the entranceway and left the bodies down there. It was horrific. And I think Vonnegut became a little unhinged as a result. I think it was such a shocking experience for a young man from Indianapolis that I had the sensation when I met Vonnegut that he was, as his children finally told me, and I think it was the right choice of words. His children told me that their father was a haunted man. And I have sensed that Kurt was always rethinking scenes. Even when he was talking, there was some film playing in his mind. You know, it's said of people who are depressives, people who have a lot of problems with depression, that they replay scenes and incidents in their head, hoping for a different outcome, wondering if they had just taken a different road or said something else or not gone on that date, how their lives may have gone. And I sense that Kurt was combing his past for things where he might have done something else, might not have been sworn into the army that day, or might not have gone down into that basement. In any event, he seemed preoccupied by some sort of monumental sadness that really was a little difficult to engage with Kurt.